In this video, I break down the 3 biggest things in the movement phase that have improved my games of 40k. Hello and welcome to Incursion Events. Today I will mostly be talking about the movement phase. I'm Luke, and as a tournament organiser, I've seen many games unravel due to missteps in movement, so I'm here to share what I've learned. Let me know in the comments if you pick up something new, and if you like what you hear, then subscribe for more. Let's get started. Plan your positioning. This might feel like obvious advice, but I'm going to flesh it out with some key examples that we can apply in our games that will bring it to life. I mentioned using terrain when thinking about deployment in my last video, which you can check out here, and this should continue as we move our army around the board, using cover to our advantage and thinking about our opponent's potential moves so that our units are as protected as possible whilst they're off grabbing objectives and shooting stuff up. I always ask about threat ranges. Each unit has its own sphere of influence in the form of a threat range. A way of thinking about this is the combined movement of that unit plus its ranged attacks or its charge distance. So how far can your opponent's units move and then be within range to shoot or charge you? Understanding these threat ranges and planning our moves accordingly is so important, considering the line of sight to units and objectives as well, factoring this into how far away we can be from these threat ranges and where we're moving in relation to the mission at hand. So instead of charging headlong into a gun line, it can often be better to hide out of line of sight near an objective or score points with a secondary mission. A well-placed unit can control key areas and dictate the flow of battle. For example, if we've got a fast combat unit behind a line of sight blocking ruin, maybe it's camped on an objective, this is a massive deterrent for an opposing force if they can't easily get an angle to shoot it. Without an opposing combat threat themselves, this unit that's been placed behind that wall, it might remain in control of that objective for the rest of the game, as if the opponent gets too close, they've got to respect that they could be charged. In this scenario, I would be more than happy simply not moving if it's racking up primary points, pushing enemies away from a key objective. Even better if we can deploy secondary objectives as well, like teleport homers or cleansing. To highlight this importance of positioning even more, a common play pattern I see when using this tactic to hide behind ruined walls is making sure the position of that unit is over an inch away from the wall on the inside of that wall. If we stand too close, then the enemy can engage us in combat. Instead, what we want to do is make sure that our models are over an inch away to prevent being engaged in combat through that wall by an enemy charging us from the other side of it. This not only increases the charge distance that they need to make it into a combat with us, but now if they want to charge, they need to be able to make it through the other side of the wall. This increases the charge distance that they need to make it into combat with us, as now if they want to charge, they need to be able to make it through the other side of the wall to get into engagement range, not just to get within an inch of that wall to be within engagement range. Whilst it might not seem like much, it can sometimes be enough to tip the odds in your favour. If possible, we also want to be close enough to the inside of the wall that the enemy models cannot fit in the gap between our models and the inside of the wall. This does depend on what exactly is charging us. Terminators on 40mm bases, for example, can be blocked easily, but units on smaller bases can't. Positioning like this makes opposing charges longer and at times even impossible if they've now got a factor going the long way around the side of a ruin to get to you. This could be game breaking if we're trying to stop our opponent reaching an objective that maybe they could only reach if they charge, but now they can't engage us through the wall, and we've now also prevented them fitting through the wall and getting to the other side of it. If we can sit out of reach from opposing danger, preferably while scoring points, we may even be able to bait an opponent into overextending into a less desirable position while they attempt to dig out our entrenched units. When respecting enemy threat ranges, it's good practice to move only as far as we need to claim objectives and not needlessly wander into the range of enemy guns. A common pitfall I have observed from watching games is falling into the trap of moving a unit its full distance as a matter of habit. The movement characteristics are limits, not targets, and we should always be positioning to avoid retaliation or return fire if we can. Careful consideration of the threat ranges that I mentioned allows us to get the most out of our units, making it as difficult as possible for the enemy to do damage to us by being exact with our movement. Move blocking and screening. The opponent has a nasty combat unit itching for a fight. What do? Throw something under the bus. Use sacrificial units as speed bumps to protect more valuable assets, keep the enemy at bay while we rain down fire and score points. This tactic not only protects our key units, but forces our opponent to react. It's all about controlling the pace of the game and setting up for the next move. Units like Nurglings are fantastic for this. If you have access to units that are cheap, expendable, and especially ones that can deploy far up the board with things like Infiltrate, they deserve consideration for a spot in your army. Something I've used Nurglings for on more than one occasion is to launch them into no man's land with the sole task of standing in front of a tank to box it in its deployment zone. If it's deployed next to a ruin and you're standing in front of it, it can't go around you and it can't go through the ruin wall. So it has to sit there and then charge you, or sit there and wait for something to shoot the Nurglings away before it moves out of its deployment zone. This is counter to the previous tip as we're intentionally exposing a unit to certain death, but it's well worth it if we can use sacrificial units, as if we're denying our opponent's movement, we're denying them the opportunity to score points, potentially denying them objectives, dealing damage to our army, and generally hampering their ability to get ahead in the game. Something as simple as this can have a chaff unit earning its weight in VPs. Well worth the sacrifice. In addition to move blocking, we want to be thinking about screening. It's not unusual to hear move blocking and screening used interchangeably. Call it what you like, I just want to make the distinction here, as when I think about screening, it's often in relation to denying enemy deep strikes. Reserves units can only enter play outside of 9 inches of enemy units. If the opponent has any reserves units, making sure that we spread out whilst using the terrain to not get shot so that they can't appear in our deployment zone is so important. We want to cover these objectives where we can, as well as our own deployment zone, so they don't have an easy ride of entering play, claiming objectives, shooting us up and charging whatever they want. A great habit to ensure efficient screening is placing units 18 inches away from each other. As deep strikes would need to be outside of 9, this means there's no way that they can deploy in the gap between these units, as they will always be within 9 inches of at least one unit. Ask your opponents if they have ways to reduce this. Factions like demons or gene stealer cults can deep strike or enter play from reserve closer than 9 inches, and make sure you fully understand how that works, as it will drastically change how you need to screen. In those games, it's a necessary evil to shrink how far we can spread out so that units can't sneak into a little gap and decimate our army. Taking the time to measure out possible areas for deep striking and clearly confirming our intent to screen out sections of the board is crucial. To be fair, this goes for any movement and positioning as well. I've seen many awkward moments in games where someone's just eyeballed their positioning, thinking they've hidden from view or screened out enemy deep strikes, but not properly communicated this with their opponent. If we own what we're doing and make sure to be clear with our communication, it makes for a much more streamlined game, removes the potential for confusion, and it also helps our opponents have a better game as well. That clear communication means they'll start their turn with a better understanding of what you've done and what is and isn't possible in their turn before they begin to move their own stuff as well. Finally, retreat. Knowing when to reposition or falling back is just as important about knowing when to charge headlong into the foe. If a unit is getting overwhelmed, falling back and regrouping is often the right play. This isn't a sign of weakness, it's a tactical withdrawal that gives us the chance to strike again at the right moment. Or, if our unit's just been decimated unexpectedly, it might just mean we have something left to be able to score secondary points or claim objectives with instead. If we can't live to fight another day, we can definitely live to score points instead. Sometimes, having a couple of models left alive means we can put them to use move blocking and screening as well. Nothing is more frustrating than charging a unit, not killing it, and then having it sit there and screen out your reserve units, forcing us to waste effort killing some stragglers. The other thing falling back allows us to do is shoot the enemy that would have otherwise been stuck in close combat. This is particularly useful when used in conjunction with our own reserves. Say we've engaged the enemy early on, perhaps innocently deploying teleport homers or cleansing an objective. Don't underestimate the 1-2 punch of luring an enemy out of position, falling back, and then using a reserves unit to blast away while they're floundering out of position. By drawing units out like this, we could even be able to keep the newly arrived reserves unit away from opposing threat ranges and free from any repercussion, as if we had brought our reserves units down a little bit closer to the enemy deployment zone, maybe they would have been more exposed. But in this scenario, we might be able to hide them a bit more effectively in ruins in our deployment zone, or just simply be out of range now of opposing enemy units. So, in summary, plan your positioning. Understand the terrain, threat ranges, and where we need to be to score mission objectives. Always have those threat ranges in mind to make sure that we're where we need to be, but without exposing our units unnecessarily. Move blocking and screening. Sacrificial units to slow down or block the advance of the enemy. Controlling what units the opponent can get to grips with so that we can keep the important things in our army alive and score. This protects our units and pushes the enemy back away from easily scoring points in the game. And retreat. A savvy use of tactical retreats, being prepared to adapt to the unfolding battle. There's no shame in running away and living to fight or score points another day. And there you have it. Hopefully I've illustrated that the movement phase is where we set up how our turns will unfold. It's so much more than just getting from point A to point B. Keeping these tactics in mind helps me to get the most out of my movement and a greater sense of agency in my games of 40k. If you've got any movement tips or strategies, please do share them in the comments. Let me know if I've missed out anything massive. And if you found this helpful, please like the video and subscribe to keep up to date with future videos. The next one is going to be all about the shooting phase, and the previous one, in case you missed it, was all about deployment. Oh, and if you're thinking about getting involved in Warhammer tournaments, then check out the description to find out more about events that I'm running in the south of England. Until next time, keep rolling those dice, thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.